Today, we'll talk about a technique called softening edges, something we do all the time in realistic watercolor painting. We'll discuss what it is, how to do it, when to do it in your painting, and we've got a simple practice exercise that you can use to hone your skills. So I hope you find this helpful. Let's get started. When you lay down a layer of color and you just let it go, just lay it down and allow it to dry. It will dry with a hard edge, and that means there will be a distinct line between the color and whatever's underneath. In this case, it's the white of the paper. When you soften, you thin the edge of the color so that it fades into the surrounding area. In this case, if you look on the right side of the image, I softened that edge so it fades into the white of the paper. 3 tips for softening edges. It's helpful to use thin consistencies. Consistency is how thick or thin the color is. It's helpful to soften while the color is still damp. The key is you want your brush to be just barely damp, not wet. And you might need to soften more than once. Let's take a look at how you can practice softening edges. So this is how I like to soften edges. Now I've got a little piece of 140-pound paper. I like to use the smoother side. This is a little smoother. You see that? That's a little rougher. That's a little more smooth. And that's personal preference. So I've taped a piece of watercolor paper to a piece of cardboard just to keep it flat. Feel free to use your favorite brush. This is a Princeton Velvetouch Long Round. I'm waking up the brush. I haven't used it yet today. And I'm dipping the brush in water, wiping it on the towel just to get it damp. I'm also waking up my color with a tube from a pen. I picked up a little water and just drop it in the tube, and this is burnt umber. Feel free to use any color that you prefer. I'm adding water to the color to create something that looks like tea to very thin milk because I like that consistency. Now let's just lay this color in with the side of the brush, and I want to show you that when it dries, it will dry with a hard edge. Now if you'd like to soften, let's do that. Let's make sure this is a thin consistency. Tea to very thin milk. I'm filling the brush with color, turning the brush to fill it. And I'm going to just lay down a bit of color, and this is how you can practice doing this. And let's just lay down a little more. I picked up a little more. Now, the key is you want to rinse that brush and wipe it on the towel so it's barely damp. And I'm thinning the very edge of the color. You see how I'm thinning it into the white of the paper? And I'm going to do it again. I just rinse the brush again and make sure that brush is barely damp when you're doing this. And you see how it fades into the white of the paper? That is softening. Now I'm going to dry this. This is a slightly thinner consistency. I'm adding water so it looks like tea. And you see how that slightly thinner consistency is lighter in value. Value is how light or dark the color is. Rinse that brush, make sure it's barely damp, and I'll thin out the edge of the color so it fades into the white of the paper. And that is what softening is. Now, why does the brush need to be barely damp? Well, let's show you here. I just dip the brush in water and it's filled with water, and see what happens here. If the brush is wet, the water will be released into the color. When it dries, it leaves a splotch. So consistency of tea to milk. I'm just showing you one more time here. Rinse the brush, wipe it on the towel on all sides of the brush. Make sure that brush is just barely damp. Now, sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes it appears sloppy. And usually it's because I'm in a hurry and the brush is a little too wet when I soften. So just let it dry. We'll get back to that. But let's see Can we soften with slightly thicker consistencies? Now I rinse the brush, wipe it on the towel. Yeah, you can soften even with a slightly thicker consistency. It just might be a little more challenging, and you might have to work a little harder at it. I prefer to use thinner consistencies, allow it to dry, then apply another layer, soften. Now, let's go back to this one because it appears a little sloppy. One thing you could do if you'd like to just smooth it out is go over it with clean water and your slightly damp brush. Just gently kind of skim over the color, and you see how it thins it out? So that's one option for cleaning it up. Now, can you do that with thicker consistencies? Let's see. With this thicker consistency, it's really easy to smear it, but you see, I'm using a very gentle touch. I'm barely touching it with the brush. Now, you can do this with any color, and I encourage you to experiment with all different colors, experiment with different shapes. This is Scarlet Lake. Make sure that brush is barely damp, and there we go. Now, I should have left it as like that, but I went back in again, and I get in a hurry, and now it's a little sloppy. I think the brush was too wet, but allow it to dry. So this is dry, and you can go over it with clean water and your slightly damp brush, and that will kind of thin out the color. We'll wake it up a little bit, then you can soften again. You can also apply another thin layer right over that first layer and then soften. So if you do need to fix something, which I often have to do, there are two techniques you could use for your bag of tricks. You could go over an area with plain water gently, or you could apply another thin layer of color. Just make sure the previous layer is completely dry. You can apply as many layers as you prefer. Make sure that brush is clean and barely damp, and use a gentle touch to avoid lifting previous layers of color. And experiment with different brushes. And you know what? The key is to practice. You'll pick up the techniques that work for you. You can experiment with, this is ultramarine blue. The biggest issue I have is at times my brush is a little too wet, and then the softening just doesn't work as well. So just know, sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't soften correctly, if you're not happy with it, you've got some ways that you can make it look better. So this is looking a little sloppy. So you allow the color to dry. You could apply another thin layer of color over it or plain water. If you find that you don't like one brush, use another brush. And this is looking sloppy, but there are ways to fix it. If you're in the early stages of your painting and you're softening and it's looking a little sloppy or you're seeing hard lines, it's okay. We've got further layers of color and fur coming that will smooth and unify what you've just created. So if you're feeling a little worried, keep going. Trust the process. And I encourage you to practice. Now, when would you soften in your painting? I often soften a lot when creating a pale map of colors at the beginning of a painting. What I'm doing here is I'm laying in a shape of color. So soften, and I'm going to add just a little more here, just a tiny, tiny bit more. You see, I'm always rinsing the brush and wiping it on the towel, and I'm softening. Here I'm doing it with gray, pale gray. This is the consistency of tea to thin milk. And I'm keeping in mind that when I soften, the color's going to come outward a little further. So I'm really taking my time laying in the initial shape. Just rinse the brush. I'm thinning out the color so it fades into the white of the paper. And sometimes when softening, I use a circular motion, or here I'm kind of touching and pulling the color and experiment with different techniques for softening. So here at the initial part of a painting, you can soften edges to help the colors to merge. Here's another example in I think it's our golden cat's eye or yellow. It's a white cat. I'm very gently applying a thin layer of gray in the upper eye, and we have a number of layers in place already. So when you're gentle, you can apply color over color. Here I'm laying in a little bit more, barely touching the brush to the paper. The brush is barely damp, and here I'm using a touching motion to thin out the edge of the color very gently. You see how the color just fades into the surrounding area. In the deer's eye, I softened from very dark brown to not so brown to very pale brown. That's an example of where you could soften. And I did a lot of softening in the lower face of the deer and in the neck. So when would you soften? When you don't want to see hard edges. In eyes, noses, ears, when you want to create a pale map of colors, when you want to establish contour and bone structure by going a little darker. Just anytime you want to transition or fade smoothly from one color to another, or when you want to go from dark to light, is when you would soften. I use softening to create contour and inward curve. Slightly darker values make it look like that part of a shape is curving away from us. And lighter values make it look like that part of a shape is coming towards us. Fade from dark to light, using softening to create the impression of inward and outward curve. On the golden bell, as we go darker, it makes it look like it's curving away from us. In the blue head of the robin, the darker values make it look like that part of the head is curving away from us. The lighter values make it look like it's coming towards us. In the ostrich, the edges of the ostrich are a little darker, and that makes it look like curving away from us. And you create that impression of inward and outward curve by softening. Thin consistencies work best for me. Tea to milk. If you have to go thicker, though, it's okay. You can still soften with thicker consistencies. I find it helpful to soften while wet when possible. When it dries, you can still do it. It's just a little more challenging. The key is the brush. You want your brush to be clean and just barely damp. And I think that takes practice until you get a feel for how damp the brush should be. You can soften more than once. If it doesn't look right, you can refine it with plain water or apply another layer or layers of color. Just make sure that previous layer has dried. Now you know what it means to soften and when to do it in your paintings. And your challenge is to practice softening. Use simple shapes, any brush you prefer, any colors. It's helpful to use thin consistencies. Soften while the color is still wet, and you want to soften with a clean, barely damp brush. And practice. If it doesn't work out, it's okay. Keep doing it. You'll hone your skills and you'll figure out what works for you. If you have any questions or suggestions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. And please like and subscribe. That will help others to find our channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.